Hey, I just want to say again, if you're new here this morning, how exciting it is that you're here. We're really glad you came. Father, you are more than we can ask or imagine. You are more than we have known. So many of us grew up with pictures of you as something distant, something merely religious, or something merely kind of telling us what to do. But you are light and you are life. You are the life of the universe. And you have come to us amazingly, perplexingly. You have come to us in Jesus, in a human person, to show us what you're like, to show us what life really is. And you've looked us in the eyes and you've said, come and follow me. And so this morning, Lord, help us to see you and help us to hear you. Even if we think we know, even if we think we've already got a good beat on it, God, disrupt all that for us and awaken our hearts to the rhythms of life, to the songs that you sing to us, to the life that you have made for us. We lift our hearts to you this morning in the good and strong and beautiful name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you. So, across the span of the Old Testament, there are all these what theologians call types and prophecies that foretell things specifically about Jesus, right? Like, for example, Micah the prophet, 700 years before Jesus, foretells that Jesus will be born in Bethlehem. And in Isaiah 53, Isaiah gives us a detailed description of the crucifixion 600 years before it happened. And those are fascinating to me, all these things that point to Christ that are difficult to explain away. But in the last few years, I've become equally fascinated with another kind of type, if you will, in the Old Testament. There are all these stories in the Old Testament that when you look at them from a certain perspective or you look a little deeper, one of the early church fathers, a guy named Origen, was famous for this. He read the Old Testament in many ways like a parable, or sort of analogically or metaphorically. He would look and he would say, oh, that person's journey or this series of events in the Old Testament, that's a foretelling of what was going to happen to us in Christ, of our journey in Christ. And so, over the next 5 weeks, I want to explore some of those stories with you in a series called The Shape of Hope and Life. Think of it like there are these shapes of people's lives and events in the Old Testament, and when you lay them over the Christian journey, you go, wow, that's really interesting. If you've been around LifeSpring long or you've listened to my preaching, you know that I think we do our faith a disservice when we treat it shallowly. Or maybe a better way to put it is when we regard ourselves shallowly. When you talk about Christianity like a religion you're supposed to follow, what you end up being is kind of like a religious automaton or robot. And when you talk about Christianity, when you think about it like it's mostly a bunch of rules to follow, you end up regarding yourself as a creature whose highest aspiration is kind of like conformity to the program. You know, here are the rules, you know. But you know, they already had that in the Old Testament. That's why Paul in his letters argues like the law will never get you there, because you'll never become a new human being by somebody just giving you a fresh set of rules. And it makes us shallow. But Jesus doesn't just give us rules. He says to the disciples and he says to us, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. And when we listen to Jesus speak in the four Gospels, the center of the journey he invites us to, the beginning of it and the center of it, is simply, only, and always the heart. That's one of the big differences, is that religion always takes us to the outward things. Jesus shows up and he starts talking to people about the heart, and they're surprised by it. Jesus says, whatever good and bad comes out of people, it has its origin in our hearts. In the parable of the seeds, the parable of the sower, the seed that produces a crop because it falls deeply into the heart. And in John's Gospel, Jesus says that when we come and drink from him, it is in and from our hearts that rivers of living water will flow. So I kind of want to dig around in the Old Testament and find some of these paintings, some of these portraits that tell us something about a heart-oriented journey with Christ. Not just the mechanics of religion, but his own presence in your life and the kind of journey, and I hope you know this by now, it's not worth really talking about this journey with God if it isn't a kind of journey that changes something about us. Something deep. Now, most people, even if they're not very religious, they want to experience God in some way. Maybe they don't call it God. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. And I have a lot of compassion, actually, for people who have what I call kind of a vague notion of God and who are kind of feeling around for that something bigger that they can't quite name. Do you know what I'm talking about? I know lots of people like that. They know there has to be something more. They don't know how to name it. They may be hesitant to name it in certain ways, even to name it Christian, but they're looking and they're wishing that whatever that more is, that they could connect with it. And I want to say to those people, I want to say, take a look at Jesus. Check out Jesus. But of course, we live in a time now when Christianity and Christians have lost a lot of credibility in a lot of people's eyes in our culture. And so there's a lot of, for a lot of people, there's kind of a resistance to that. And I totally understand that, but I still want to say, look at Jesus. Check out Jesus. But the challenge now for us is to hold out to people, to describe to people, to model for people a Christian journey that's as good and as beautiful as Jesus himself is. What I have found is that things really begin to change in a person's search for God when they come to an open-hearted place, and that can happen a lot of different ways. Sometimes open-hearted comes through broken-hearted. But when they come to an open-hearted place, and then in that space, in that moment, in that season of their life, God starts to call their name. Happens in lots of different ways. And this is what happened to Abraham in the Old Testament. Abraham is considered the father of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths. He lived some 1,800, 1,900 years before Jesus. And what happens to Abraham is that God begins to call his name. And I want to read you a little of that story. It's in Genesis chapter 12. I'm just going to read you the first 4 verses. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him, that's his nephew, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now, who is Abraham? Well, he lived in this place called Ur of the Chaldeans, which today is southern Iraq. We move from Genesis chapter 11. You remember the story about the Tower of Babel? That's in the chapter right before this. In Genesis chapter 11, we have this story of idolatry and these people, building this temple and saying we can reach up to the heavens, we can be like God, and God causes this confusion and kind of separates them. And the very next frame of the story is Abram, who lives in the region where this Tower of Babel thing happened. And what the book of Genesis paints is that this is a time when Adam's descendants have kind of lost track of God. Jewish folklore says that Terah, the father of Abraham, was a maker and seller of wooden idols. In fact, in Jewish folklore, there's this interesting little story that as Abraham begins to doubt the truth and capability of idols, he goes into his father's workshop and he cuts up all the inventory. Right? This is a store, basically. This is a production plant. He cuts up all the idols. And when his father comes in, he says, "What have you done?" And Abraham says, "I didn't do it. The idols got into a fight with each other. And they hacked each other up." And Abraham's father, Terah, says to him, "Son, why are you lying to me? You know that idols can't move or do anything. And Abraham says, well, if that's the case, that they can't move or do anything, why are we asking them to make it rain and grow the crops? You picture Tara going, okay, I got to think about that one for a minute. Joshua 24 does tell us that Abraham and his father and his family, when they were living in Ur, were idol worshippers. Now, because of excavations, we also know something about the religion of Ur at that time. Ruins of a ziggurat, which is sort of a kind of a stepped tower with a temple on top. That is actually the ziggurat of Ur. They excavated it and they rebuilt it in replica form to the original size and shape in the 1980s in Iraq. Some people call it sort of the pyramid of the Middle East. So ruins of this were found, and it was found that they were dedicated to the Sumerian god Nana, which is the god of the moon and the god of wisdom. Now, I wish Abraham were here because I have a lot of questions for Abraham. I want to know what he really believed before God came and knocked on his door. Just because he may have believed in this moon and wisdom deity doesn't necessarily mean he wasn't seeking God. There are lots of religions where there are lots of gods, but then above all those gods, the people of that religion kind of know and sometimes it's an unknown God, but we know there's something bigger. It's there's all kinds of spirituality elements to Native American indigenous peoples' religion, but above them all, if you ask any Native American, they'll say, well, above them all is a great spirit. And so we don't really know exactly what Abraham believed, to what degree he was seeking God. Nevertheless, I love how Genesis 12:1 very matter-of-factly says that the Lord God showed up to Abraham, this Mesopotamian moon worshiper, and said, hey, I want you to pack up all your stuff, and your wife, and your kids, and your family, and I want you to go to a completely different country that I'm going to take you to. And then it just says, so Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken to him. It's hey, Abraham, I want you to pack up what you can and leave your friends and family and go to a new country. And Abraham's like, no problem, let me go tell Sarah and the kids that, we're leaving tomorrow. It's a big deal. So I don't know what that experience was like for Abraham. I would love to know what was going through his mind and how he was thinking about this God who was speaking to him and directing him. But I do know my own experience. I know my own experience of when God came and knocked on my door in my life. And so this morning I want to tell you 3 things that I believe God is up to when he calls your name. And I think they're important. The first almost goes without mention in the beginning of the story about Abraham, and that is this. When God begins to call your name, he's calling you into a relationship with himself. Now, when we first hear the story of Abraham, what God focuses on in the part that's recorded is, hey, I'm going to take you to a different country, and through you all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And there's not a lot said in the very beginning about this relationship. But it's very interesting that all throughout the rest of the Old Testament, over and over, do you know what Abraham is referred to as? The friend of God. Nobody else was ever called that. And Abraham is called the friend of God. And the extent of God's love for and commitment to Abraham, it's portrayed strikingly 3 chapters later in Genesis 15, when God enters into a formal covenant with Abraham. So, God told Abraham, your descendants are going to be numerous, and all the people of the earth are going to be blessed through you. And so at one point, while Abraham's beginning this journey, he says to God, how do I know you're really going to do this? Especially because his wife was barren. You may remember that part of the story. Can't have kids. He says, and God says, your descendants will be as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And so Abraham says to God, how do I know this is going to happen? And God says, okay, here's what I want you to do. This is in Genesis 15. It says, I want you to go get a bunch of animals. And apparently Abraham, there's not a lot of detail given. So it just says what Abraham did. But it seems like Abraham, I don't know if God gave him more explanation than the text tells us, but it seems like Abraham knew where God was going with this. I don't know. Because Abraham goes and he gets all these animals, and he kills them, and he cuts them into pieces. And he lines both sides of a path with them. And then Genesis 15 says, as the sun began to go down, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and God spoke to him. And God told him, he said, here's the deal. It's not all going to happen right away, buddy. Because actually, your descendants, your grandchildren, they're going to go down into Egypt, and they're going to become slaves there. You know this story, right? But they're going to multiply like rabbits. It doesn't say that in the text, but they're going to multiply like rabbits, because they do. Like, when the Israelites came out of Egypt, scholars think there were like 2 million of them. So they're going to multiply, and in the fourth generation, I'm going to bring them out of there, and I'm going to bring them back to this very land that I have promised you. And then the weirdest thing happens in this story. It's not just that he goes into sleep and, got some dead animals. Abraham falls into sleep. Then while Abraham is sleeping, a smoking fire pot and a torch appear. And they float down the path between the cut pieces of the animals on both sides. Now you read this as a modern reader and you go, pretty weird, right? But if you were an ancient reader, you would have known exactly what this is, because this was a very particular kind of a treaty or a covenant that people would make, where two chiefs or rulers or just two people would make a vow to each other of what they were going to do for each other. They'd commit to some obligation they were going to do for each other. And then they would line a path with these parts of dead animals, these slaughtered animals, and they would walk down the path. Each of them would walk down the path between the animals. And what they were saying by that was this: may this be done to me if I do not fulfill my word to you. And so God comes in this mysterious way, because God is always weirdly mysterious, and he walks between the pieces to say, Abraham, may this happen to me if I do not fulfill this promise that I have made to you. Of course, what's interesting is that God doesn't require Abraham to make an oath. He promises what he will do, and it doesn't depend on Abraham. He doesn't say, now, Abraham, wake up, you got to walk between the pieces. And for me, this kind of prefigures the cross, where God offers a new covenant established not by a mutual agreement. Have you ever thought of that? Like, Jesus doesn't come to the Last Supper and say, okay, cut in mine, palms out, boys, you got to bleed too. Jesus takes the cup, and he says, this is my love for you. This is the new covenant in my blood. I'm going to walk between the pieces. I'm not requiring that of you. Now, to know God and let him change you and make a new human being out of you, that is going to require something of you. But not the covenant. When God expresses this sacrificial covenantal love for us, his first order of business is to begin to rescue us, to bring us out of darkness and into light and life. And there's a really interesting kind of almost hidden word in the beginning of Abraham's story about this that would be very interesting, very, very easy to miss. Just a couple of verses later, in verse 8, we read this. And Abraham moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west. Wait a minute, that's west for us. With Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. He pitched his tent smack between Bethel and Ai, which in Hebrew is Hae. So Bethel means the house of God. You know what Hae means? A heap of ruins. And Abraham pitches his tent. The journey has him smack between those two things. Some of you know my story about how God began to draw me to himself out of very dark places as a teenager. And this description of, when I was studying this week, this description of where Abraham pitches his tent just really resonates with me deeply. Like, I feel like, I was just this, drugged out, messed up, into my rope 15-year-old. And in a way I would never have expected, God began to knock on my door. God began to call my name. And as I took my first steps with him, it began to be clear that in one direction, there was the house of God. There was Bethel, the house of light and love and goodness and hope. And in the other direction, there was a heap of ruins. And I'd been hanging out at the heap of ruins in my life for a long time. And I think when we begin to hear God call to us, and I don't know how you've experienced that in your life. I don't want to talk about it like, your experience is my experience, or surely you've had this experience. I don't know what that experience is for you. But however God begins to get your attention, begins to knock on your door, begins to call your name, eventually this is where we all end up, is this realization that, well, that's not really true. If somebody sells us Jesus as just a bunch of religion, we won't realize this, and I'll get to that. But most of us, actually I would say it this way, if we're fortunate, we end up with the realization that in one direction is the house of God's love and light and goodness and truth, and in the other direction is a heap of ruins. And it so reminds me of Jesus' statement on the Sermon on the Mount that there are two roads. There's this broad road that leads to destruction. And Jesus is not talking about hell there. You can go read it in the Sermon on the Mount. He's talking about destruction. He's talking about you're a mess, life's a mess. You got this broad road that leads to destruction, Jesus says, but then there's this narrower way, and it leads to life. And this is where when people look at God and they see only religion, they miss where the road leads. They miss where God in His love is actually trying to take us. They think, oh, God just wants me to be religious, or God just wants me to keep these rules. But do you know what the questions really are that determine whether you end up living in the house of life and love and goodness or down at the heap of ruins? You know what those questions really are? They're very much what you might call everyday life-oriented questions. Not everybody's asking them, but they're questions like this. What will you end up thinking life is really about? Where will you think contentment is really found? Well, there's a lot of different answers to that out there, aren't there? In what things will you believe happiness and joy really consist? Everybody wants to be happy. Where are you chasing it? How will you look at and feel about yourself? Boy, there's a house of life and love and truth and goodness or heap of ruins kind of question, isn't it? Because a lot of us see ourselves as a heap of ruins. How will you look at and feel about yourself? How will you look at other people? Are other people, I spent a lot of my life, honestly, even as a pastor when I was younger, seeing other people as kind of accomplices to what I was trying to get out of things. And I think that's how a lot of people see people. But how will you look at other people? How will your relationships turn out? Will there be any place larger than you where your soul can be centered? You answer those questions one way, or you look in one direction. House of life and love, goodness and truth. You answer them a different way. Heap of ruins. If you're here this morning or you're listening this morning and you haven't yet discovered a relationship with this God of love, I want to tell you that He wants a relationship with you. And He wants to rescue you from darkness and confusion and bring you into love and life and goodness in a maybe not perfect clarity, because we're never going to figure it all out on this side of things, but greater clarity than you have had about things. You know, there's a lot I don't know. There's even a lot I don't know about God, but I can tell you that I am so grateful that I have not had to walk these years of life alone. Maybe that's why some people seem to drift away from their faith and come back, and drift away from their faith and come back. And my faith has had ups and downs, just like yours, just like everybody's. But since I was probably 18, I just kind of mentioned this on our walk the other night. Since I was 18, I've never really come to that place where I've said, I'm done with this Christian thing, and then I've come back, and then I'm done with it, and then I've come back. And maybe the reason for that is I don't want to be alone. I've tasted what it is to not walk alone. And that doesn't mean I, every moment, know exactly what God is doing in my life or what He's saying to me, or that there aren't times where I wonder, well, God, aren't you going to show up and do something about this mess or that mess? I go through those things too. But I always know I'm not alone. And I am so grateful for that. And so if you don't have that kind of a relationship with God, I'm telling you that's who He wants to be for you. And the other thing is that I look back, as I talk about this difference between, walking up the road to the house of life and love and goodness and truth versus, going back to the heap of ruins. As I think about that in my life, one of the things I see now, maybe you have to journey for a while before you can see it, but one of the things I see now is that God has made more out of me, and that's not like, that kind of thing, but God has made more out of me than, frankly, I think anybody would have believed when I was younger. I was a walking disaster. And God's done some really good things in my life. And I can't explain that any other way. I often say to people, if the Lord had not gotten a hold of my heart and gotten my attention, I honestly don't know where I would be, what I would be doing, or who I would be today. I don't know. I might have gone off in any of a dozen cockamamie directions in my life. As they say, but for the grace of God, there go I. But I've been hearing this invitation for 40-some years in my life. Come walk up the road to the house of life and love and truth and goodness. Now, all of this about relationship with God, this was the first of my 3 points. So I guess I have to express the other two in substantially shorter form. The second thing God does when He calls your name is that He begins to take you somewhere different. God says to Abraham, get out of your present country and go to a new country that I will show you. And I'll tell you, if you had come to me in the early years of my faith and you had said to me, Fran, just try to imagine. Let your imagination run wild, Fran. And just try to imagine the places God will take you over the decades ahead. Just try. Turn your imagination loose. I could not have imagined many, if not most, of the places this journey has taken me. And with Linda, in many ways, has taken us. Like, I've had so many friendships that had their genesis in this journey with Jesus, friendships with other people who came onto the road with Jesus. And I've had beautiful friendships, and I've had broken friendships, and I've had broken friendships that became beautiful friendships again. But there's been something redemptive that's always been happening, or mostly in those friendships with all their ups and downs, different from sort of just like if I had taken a different path in life and I'd say, I got a couple buddies. Friendships have been something different than that. I couldn't have seen that coming. I've been broke, depressed, and scared across the years in ways that only God could show up and rescue me. I've been with people, and some of this is, I suppose, because of being a pastor, but I've been with people at some of their best moments of life, when they're dedicating their children, when they're saying their wedding vows. And I've been with people at some of the most tragic and loss-filled moments of their lives. I've laughed with children and wept with their parents in the poorest villages of Haiti. I've had the adventure of trying to shepherd other people. And let me tell you, that's adventure with a capital A, right? So I've had the adventure of trying to shepherd other people, and God has used 40 years of married life to try to... Seriously, if you said, 2 big things you've gotten out of 40 years of married life, this is what it is. God has used 40 years of married life to, 1, attempt to root the selfishness out of me. And 2, to give me a vision and an experience of what open-hearted relationship between 2 people can actually be. But it isn't just these things that I've listed, the country I couldn't have imagined, Along this road, I've had to let my heart and my thinking be changed 1,000 times. I could never have seen that, right? Especially because when I first became a Christian, and many of you have had this experience, I became a Christian in places where, well, not when I became a Christian, but it didn't take too many years, where I was in places, in churches, where they said, you have the Bible, you now know everything that's true, and you'll never have to change your mind again. Yeah. I got one verse for you. 1 Corinthians 8:1, the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, right? We think of him as like the greatest theologian of the early church, right? What does he say? He says this: the person who thinks he knows should take heed, for he does not yet know as he ought. I've had to change my mind and my heart. Oh, my heart, Life's full of ups and downs. It's full of people ups and downs. And your heart gets, people pick up your heart, and they do some things with it, and they get stuff back in you. Say, God, stuff in my heart, I got to deal with it. You got to straighten some things out. I've had to go through just that whole process over and over of saying, Lord, I need to be centered in you. I need to think like you think, and I need my heart like your heart. And I've often had to rethink what they told me Jesus and Christianity were about. And here's the thing: this whole journey that I've been on, and in the midst of that, we raised kids, have businesses, started a church, and in the midst of all of this, I could not have imagined barely a scrap of this. So, can you picture it? 15 years old, messed up little 15-year-old Fran Lehman, and God comes along to me in my Ur of the Chaldees, and he says, hey, Fran, this is Jesus. Why don't you come with me and we'll go some places you've never seen before? And I go, all right. There's a reason God doesn't tell you in advance what the adventure is going to look like. But here's the thing. I wouldn't change a thing. You tell me where you can get this kind of adventure of a God who's going to take you places that you never could have imagined. And you tell me where you're going to find anybody else besides this great and beautiful God who is going to stick with you through all those twists and turns and valleys and trips over the mountain and bumps in the road, and who's going to be there right with you all the time. Because you know what he said to us at the cross? May it be done unto me if I don't fulfill my promise to you. That's how serious I am about my promise to you. So God wants a relationship with you. He wants to take you places that you've never been before, new places. And thirdly, when God calls your name, for all the million things he's going to do for you, he's actually also calling you for some purposes bigger than yourself. He's calling you to be a blessing in some way to others. And I don't know what that's going to look like in your life. It's going to look a certain way in my life. It's going to look a different way in your life. As Aslan tells Lucy in one of the Narnia stories, no one is told any story but his own. So I can't tell you your story. And I don't think it's that when I say God has called your name so that you can be a blessing, a help to other people, I don't think it means that you have to have this thing, which I've had at points in my life, like I got to go out and change the whole world, I'll tell you what I think the secret of this is, and I'm not an expert, but I think it's to look around yourself and wonder who you can love, or who you can help, or who it is that you can bless. Maybe that's your spouse or your partner. Have you really looked at them lately and wondered what it would be to bless them, to bring them joy, to help them walk up the road to the house of life and love? Maybe it's to bring joy to a child or comfort to a friend or to be a faithful friend to somebody across this long haul of life. Those are hard to find. Or maybe it's to remind someone of their worth, or maybe it's to put some money in someone's hands when they need it. Maybe God's put a little money in your pocket and you have that opportunity to help somebody else when those times come along. Or maybe it's to stand up for someone in the face of some injustice, and we have a share of that in our culture these days. And so maybe it's that. I'll tell you what it probably be. You might say, oh, Pastor Fran, I'm not an evangelist. But I'll tell you what it'll probably be at some point if you just walk this road with him. At some point, it's going to mean that you're going to help somebody else come into this relationship with Jesus. It'll surprise you where and when that happens, Sometimes Christians have this idea like, we're going to go out and pound Jesus into everybody. The better thing to do is just to say, Lord, put me at the right place, at the right time, with the right people. The person who ridiculed my faith the most when I was 15, 16, 17 years old and I was this new little Christian was my oldest brother, Joe. And he doesn't listen to my sermons, I don't think, but he'd laugh if he listened to this one. Because he just, he gave me a hard time. And then many, many years later, Linda and I and the kids made a trip out to California, and my brother Joe has had a lot of ups and downs in life. And he was going through some pretty tough stuff. And he walked in my mom's front door. We had just arrived, I think. And he slumped down on the floor with his back against the refrigerator in the kitchen. And I guess he was talking to me because I was the only other person in the room. And he said, "I just wish somebody would tell me what it's all about." This is a guy who's been making fun of my faith for years, right? And I'm like... So I thought, I'm going to take the very cautious route here. I said, "So, like, if somebody sort of tried, do you think you'd listen?" And he said, "I think I actually might." One of the ways you're going to bless people, maybe somehow, I think, along the way, is you're going to help them see real Jesus, the God who is love, who can make a difference in their life the way he's making a difference in your life. God said to Abraham, and God says to you, "Through you the peoples of the earth will be blessed." There's an almost parallel Jesus story, except not spoken to one person, spoken to a crowd. In the Sermon on the Mount, we see Jesus standing on a hillside with a crowd of just everyday village people, not the village people, but, everyday people in front of him. And Jesus says to this group of people, "You are the light of the world." And I always say, if I'd been in that crowd, I'd been like, "Who's he talking? Is he talking to me? Must be talking to the person next to me. Surely not talking." No, he's talking to you. You are the light of the world. You've been blessed to be a blessing. The last thing I want to tell you this morning is that your story is very unique. It's like Abraham's was, and I think you should accept that. I think we have a hard time accepting that. I have. Our tendency is to compare our story to other people's story. Probably a lot of different reasons we do that. Sometimes it's because we're trying to figure out, like, how we should do it, right? Like, well, they're doing it this way. Maybe I should do it that way, whatever it is in life. And sometimes I think it's because we're afraid that we're not as significant as other people. So we compare ourselves to other people like, well, boy, they seem to really have it all together or have it all figured out. Let me tell you something about people who have it all together and have it all figured out. It always looks that way from a distance. Just get up close to them and hang around with them and you'll realize, oh, it's not quite as together as it looks, So don't compare yourself to other people. Don't compare your story to other people. God is writing, He's telling a story in you. It's your story. It's going to be unique. And then, and this is the weird part, I don't know exactly how it works. I should because I'm a pastor, but I don't know. And then when we all come together in the community of Jesus, He tells that story in a unique way through us. And that's an amazing and beautiful thing. So I'll tell you how I'd like to end my time with you this morning. I'd like you to just close your eyes. And I'd like you to think of your story like a book. God's writing the pages. Some of you, you're a little older like me, you've got a lot of pages in that book already. Some of you are young, you're on like page 12. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to picture your life like a story, like a book. You know how you hold an open book? You put your hands under it, and you hold it like this? I want you to just put your hands out in front of you with your eyes closed. I want you to hold your book. I just want you to hold your story. And I want you to just be quiet for a minute. And in that quietness, find a way to whisper to God, "Lord, come write my story. Come tell my story." It's between you and Him. Just hold it there. If you'll do that in your life, if you'll recognize that He's the one writing the story, and one of the things He's going to say to you is, He's going to say, Susan, we got places to go. Come with me. Erica, we got places to go. Come with me. Chris, Michael, John and Amy,